Everyone. I'm Cheryl Hung, and I'm so happy and pleased to be here at Authcon joining you today. I'm going to be talking about building the customer identity community together. We're going to talk about some of the challenges. I'm going to tell you some of the stories that I've had in my time running communities, and hopefully give you a bit of encouragement and a bit of a push if you've been thinking about it to go out there and try and get involved yourself. The agenda for today, I'm going to start with an introduction of myself and my background. I'm going to talk about why I think it's important to build together, what the landscape looks like today for customer identity and access management. I'm going to identify some areas that I think there is an opportunity and give you some hints and tips and tricks on how to get started, how to bootstrap. And then I'll finish up with a conclusion. My name is Cheryl Hung. You can find me online at oicheryl.com. I'm the Senior Director of Infrastructure Ecosystem at Arm, where I'm working on driving the adoption of Arm across data centers and servers in the cloud and in AI. I'm also the founder of Cloud Native London, which is a meetup dedicated to cloud native based in London with over 9,000 members. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. First up, building together why I think it's important to get involved with community. So I'll tell you a little bit about my journey with community, with the tech community. When I was a teenager, my absolute dream was to go work at Google and be a software engineer at Google. I'm not quite sure why I thought this was the case. All I know is that they serve free food and they give you massages. And I was like, okay, I'm good at maths. That sounds great to me. Like, I don't think I knew what software engineering was, but it sounded like a great job. So I studied computer science, I got my degree, and I went into Google as a software engineer. And I did that for 5 years, working on Google Maps, mainly writing C++ as a backend engineer. And I left in 2015, and I was burnt out, so burnt out. I hated it all. I hated tech. I hated coding. I hated software. I didn't want to see anything anymore of it. And I spent basically a year not really doing anything at all with tech, like barely not doing anything coding related, really. I thought maybe I was just not good at this tech stuff. Maybe this was not the career for me, and I should go and retrain and go be a turnip farmer or something. So yeah, I was really like aged sort of 25, 26, 27, really hated all things tech. And then what pulled me out of this funk and this sort of pessimism was going to meetups again and talking to other developers and finding out what new technology there was going around, what the problems were, and kind of getting excited again about tech outside of Google, especially because Google was such an insular community. You know, people worked on Google infrastructure, and once you left, there was nothing like that outside. So I had been very isolated from the tech industry at that point, and slowly, bit by bit, I started to get involved and see other people and kind of get interested in tech again. And around that time, 2016 or so, something called Docker or containers was just about coming up, along with the idea of orchestration and cloud native. And these were concepts that were sort of familiar to me because Kubernetes had come out from Google's Borg, the internal platform, which I'd used before and I understood. So I kind of made this move into infrastructure because the timing was right and I knew like this is what I wanted. This was something I was already familiar with and I could go out there and bring it to other people. I also started going to other conferences. I attended one called DevRelCon, Developer Relations Conference, at a time when DevRel was not really known at all as a career path or a job role the way it is today. And I thought, okay, if I go into DevRel, I can keep one foot in technology, but also go out there and talk to people and interact with people and write and do other things, do talks. And so I made this move. I joined a startup. The startup was in storage, container storage, and they were looking for their first developer advocate. So I joined them as employee number 12. And while I was there, I created this meetup called Cloud Native London. That was in 2017. So I was looking for cloud native meetups to speak at. There was a cloud native Berlin, cloud native Paris, and there wasn't one in London. So I thought, well, let me give it a go, see what happens. I picked a date 7 weeks away into the future, put it on meetup.com. I had absolutely nothing. I had no venue, no speakers, no sponsors, absolutely nothing. And I kind of scrambled for those 7 weeks to put together an event. And the very first time, over 100 people showed up. And that was the moment when I really thought, wow, okay, there's something to it. There's some interest here. That led me to working in open source full-time, working for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is the open source foundation behind Kubernetes. So even though I've worked at other companies since then, I continue to run Cloud Native London and continue to be part of the developer community outside of my subsequent roles at Apple and at Arm. And the community is what got me out of that slump post-Google. And it's what keeps me going even now. And there's a saying that I came across recently, said, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And that's what I've really, really found with community. This is the meetup. I think I ran this one last week. Actually, this is a photo from last week, where I've been running it for 8 years now. And it's a group of people from all different industries, all different backgrounds and career paths, but all with an interest to go together. So now on to today and the topic of today, which is customer identity and access management. So let's start by revising where we are and how we got to today. We're going to look at the past 30-ish years, starting back in the 90s. The 90s was the era of early web, and it was the era of mainly enterprises. So LDAP being adopted for internal access management and internal identity. But very soon, as the web started to grow, companies decided that they needed to provide a bit more of a seamless experience, because every website and everything out there was asking you for a different identity. So this was the era of some early standards and the beginnings of single sign-on. So where you could say log in with Twitter or log in with Google, and it would use your identity from somewhere else in a standardized way in order to access whatever you wanted. From the 2010s onwards, this was the rise of kind of consumer issues, and again, making things more seamless and more secure as well. So for example, this was the era of where we started to see hardware keys and also biometrics come up. This is also when GDPR was passed in Europe. So more and more companies needed to be careful of how they manage their data and their customers' data that way. And finally, reaching the 2020s, now we have even more concerns around security, about how we manage policy while making sure that our users still have appropriate levels of privacy and passwordless sign-on. So again, the whole scope of this has become a lot more complicated and complex to manage compared to the early days, where it was just a case of knowing who your user was. And as a result, there are many, many groups that have sprung up to manage different areas of this. So several of these standards like OAuth and OpenID Connect are managed under these groups and these initiatives. And within Cloud Native, which is the community that I'm most familiar with, there's also been a couple of projects like Dex and Keycloak to manage this, and different groups that interact with customer identity in different ways. So, for example, the Cloud Native Security Group and the App Delivery Group also work quite closely in terms of authorization and authentication. So, where do I see opportunity in all of this? I'm going to make a bit of an assumption here, which is that you are probably an engineer or technical person of some sort, and you probably feel comfortable with submitting a pull request on GitHub, let's say. So I'm not really going to go over how you contribute and how you write a pull request and how you start using GitHub. I'm also going to make the assumption that you are maybe not a person who has written one of these global industry standards and got them adopted by thousands of developers all over the world and leading these foundations and group yourself. My guess is you sit somewhere in the middle. So you're comfortable with submitting some code to fix a small problem that you have. You're maybe not quite comfortable with the idea of, okay, I'm going to go out there and write a standard and adopt it. So what lies in the middle? How do you bridge that gap? The truth of the matter is, this community work, these standards work, this kind of work, it's time consuming, it's risky, and it's overwhelming. And why do I say that? It's time consuming because it just is. It takes years and years to form these groups, get people to buy into your ideas, get them to adopt it, and clean up all the mess that happens afterwards. Often it's risky because sometimes you can put a lot of work into something and it just doesn't play out. If you've ever seen that XKCD about there were 14 standards here and this is such a mess and I'm just going to go write my own one and make everything nice. And oh no, now I've got 15 standards. Like, quite often stuff just doesn't pan out the way that you expect it to. And it's overwhelming because there are so many players already in the market. There's so many companies and alliances and federations and whatever else that you need to work with. But here are some stories of kind of why I think it still matters and why I think it's still worth it. And so if you're familiar with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, it's basically a open source organization that holds a bunch of open source projects. From a legal perspective, that means it holds the trademarks and the domain names and the GitHub repos. And one of these projects, one of the early ones, in fact, is called NATS. And a company called Synadia contributed this project into CNCF. And it's been inside CNCF for nearly 10 years now. And a few months ago, Synadia decided that it wanted to reclaim the project from CNCF, despite the fact that it had previously signed agreements saying that it wouldn't do so. By donating to CNCF, it was like one way, it would never leave the foundation. So this became a little bit of a battle, a bit of a legal back and forth. Synadia had received some $10,000 from CNCF in order to hand over, to do the transfer over the trademarks. Synadia had not done it. So anyway, there was a bit of back and forth and a bit of question about how this would end. And really the goal behind this for Synadia was to relicense NATS code from Apache 2.0, very, very common open source license, to the business source license, or BSL, meaning that it would have more control over how people could use and customize and sell its code, the NATS code. The outcome of all of this, as of just a week or so ago, was that CNCF and Synadia came to an agreement that it would continue to hold the trademark and hold the domain name and the GitHub repositories. But there was a lot of uncertainty in the community about if Synadia really did reclaim control of NATS, what would that mean for any user of NATS? Would it mean that they now would no longer be able to contribute, or that Synadia would now require them to license, to pay for licenses from them? And this is a trend that we've been seeing more and more, this relicensing open source projects. So Redis has relicensed, and Elasticsearch a couple of years back, Terraform as well. We're starting to see this trend because more and more companies now in a more difficult economic environment have decided that they want to try and reclaim or recapture more of the value from these open source projects, which is absolutely reasonable from a business perspective, but from a community perspective can put them in a bit of a funny stage, a funny kind of place in terms with the users. And to give you another example, Linkerd is another project underneath CNCF. And last year, instead of relicensing the project, they decided that the code would stay open source, but the releases would not. So if you wanted to use a future release of Linkerd beyond 2.15, then you would have to talk to the company that primarily funded the maintainers behind Linkerd in order to gain that release. Or else you could obviously do all the work of packaging and testing yourself. But that was the state of it. So more and more we're starting to see that projects which users assume are open source and will be open source forever and free forever, are not necessarily being that way. And of course, everybody relies on open source now. Everybody uses open source. So even though community work is time consuming, it is risky, it is overwhelming, but it is also necessary because you have a stack that is built on top of these open source projects. And therefore you open yourself up to some future risk that the stack that you've been using can get pulled away from you unexpectedly. So by getting involved now, getting involved early, that is actually cheaper than waiting until the last moment and then finding out that you suddenly need to re-architect everything because the company that has been supporting the open source funding has decided to switch it to something else. So going back to this, like you're probably somewhere between, I know how to submit a pull request and I know how to write a industry standard. Let me give you an example of a group that I bootstrapped and give you the story of it as an idea of how you might go about doing something a little bit in between. So a few years ago, while I was still working at CNCF, someone reached out to me about a maturity model. He said they'd been working on a maturity model and wanted to contribute it to CNCF and have it owned as CNCF by CNCF as an asset. And I said, okay, and I filed it away. About a year later, another person completely independently approached me and said, hey, in my consultancy, we've been working on a cloud native maturity model, and we think it would be great if CNCF wanted to host this maturity model. And so I dug back through all my emails and discussions and notes. And then I also had a thought, and I searched back through the blogs of CNCF, and I found that another person, a third person, had also written a cloud native maturity model and had written it up as a blog post. So to me, that was the tipping point where I was like, if there are 3 people interested in this who've independently come up with this idea, then there must be some kind of compelling reason for it. And so I put together a meeting with the 3 people, Simon, Danielle, and another person called John. And I asked them to pull together not just a maturity model, but a group that would own the model and own keeping it up to date and own spreading the word about it, educating people on it, and own bringing in new people to keep the group fresh and keep new ideas coming in. So they enthusiastically created this group called Cartographos, which still exists, and started working on it together. And within about a year or so, had published it and had started talking about it through the KubeCon conferences. And I put this together because I wanted to show you that these projects are often just a confluence of people and time and being the person who knows roughly what's going on, and spotting that there's a moment when it's possible to bootstrap something like this. So if you feel like there's something missing, then I encourage you to get involved and be involved and bootstrap something, because it's not the case that you have to be a great developer and you have to have a finished project and whatever before you start. It's also not the case that you have to be a developer at all. I got my start in the community through running meetups, running developer events, and there are many, many different disciplines that all contribute towards having a strong community that can defend itself. So I just hope that I'm a big believer in getting people together and having these conversations, and something wonderful comes out of it. So let's have a look at some takeaways from today's conversation. The first one is, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. The second is, right now, in my opinion, the customer identity access management is really scattered. There are a whole bunch of different groups, some of which are very clearly around a single standard or a handful of standards, but the end user experience of it is very unclear. There's no clear groups about where you go to understand how to use these. And so this is why I'm particularly excited by Authcon, because this is, to me, a fantastic opportunity to meet with other people who are running into the same issues, and hopefully to find an opportunity to build something from this. And then thirdly, you can bootstrap. You can start small. You can start with almost nothing, and you can build it up into a group that is bigger than yourself and really has that impact beyond just your company, just your team, just your own day-to-day work. And I really encourage you to do so and to go and talk to other people today. Thank you so much. These slides are on my blog at oicheryl.com, and I look forward to connecting with you.